The Middle East is, well, it feels like it's constantly a geopolitical pressure cooker, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Always simmering.
And things really heated up again. On June 13th, 2025, we saw reports flooding in about significant U.S. airstrikes.
Yes. Targeting apparently 3 Iranian nuclear facilities. Some called it Operation Midnight Hammer, others Rising Lion.
Right. And almost immediately, Iranian officials came out strong. They vowed retaliation.
Forcefully. They said the U.S. had crossed a very big red line, that specific phrase.
Exactly. So tensions are sky high. The rhetoric is escalating. And the critical question for all of us really is,
Yeah.
what are Iran's options? What can they actually do to strike back?
And crucially, what are the ripple effects, especially for the global economy?
Particularly when we talk about this tiny but just incredibly vital stretch of water, the Strait of Hormuz.
Ah, yes, the Strait. It's absolutely central to this whole thing.
So let's dive into that. What
Yeah.
makes this strait so important?
Okay, to really get why Iran has leverage here, you need to picture the Strait of Hormuz. It's this narrow maritime channel.
Like a bottleneck.
Exactly, a bottleneck. It connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and then that opens out into the Arabian Sea. Think of it like a valve, maybe, for global energy.
A valve.
And a massive amount of the world's energy supply, its oil, has to pass through this incredibly narrow point.
How narrow are we talking?
Well, at its tightest, it's only about 33 kilometers. That's maybe 21 miles wide.
Wow, that's not much at all.
It really isn't. But the actual shipping lane where these huge tankers have to go is even narrower. Just 3 kilometers, about 2 miles wide in each direction.
Just 2 miles.
And here's the key thing. That entire lane lies within the territorial waters of Iran and Oman.
So Iran has direct control over half of that vital lane.
Essentially, yes. Geographically, it gives them immense strategic positioning. And this tiny strip of water, it handles, get this, more than a quarter of all global seaborne oil trade.
A quarter. Just through there.
A quarter. And about 1/5, maybe 20% of all the oil and petroleum products the entire world consumes.
That's staggering.
It is. In the first half of 2023, for example, something like 20 million barrels of oil flowed through it every single day.
20 million barrels. Daily.
Daily. If you put a dollar figure on it, that's nearly $600 billion in energy trade passing through that narrow strait every year.
Goodness, so any disruption there.
Has immediate global consequences. It's the economic artery, really, for a huge chunk of the world's oil. Its stability is directly tied to, well, the price of almost everything. Your gas, goods shipped globally.
And who relies on it most heavily?
Well, you've got major OPEC members, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE. They are massively dependent on it for their exports.
How much are we talking?
Saudi Arabia alone moves about 5.5 million barrels a day through the strait.
Wow.
And then think about Asia. For Asian economies, its importance is just paramount. In 2022, something like 82% of all the crude oil and condensates leaving the strait were headed for Asia.
82%.
Yeah. China, for instance, buys around 90% of Iran's own oil exports, which mostly go through there. But beyond Iran's oil, China, India, South Korea, Japan, these huge economies rely heavily on the strait for their overall energy needs.
Okay, so it's geographically narrow, clearly vital. But why is it so irreplaceable? I mean, why isn't there an easy workaround, a safer route for such a critical resource?
Well, the short answer is there really aren't many easy alternatives, certainly not at that scale. And its location, as we said, gives Iran just immense leverage.
And they know it.
Oh, absolutely. Iran has a long history, a documented history of threatening to close the strait. It's a recurring theme, a tool in their geopolitical toolkit.
Have they ever actually done it?
We'll get to that. But the threats themselves are significant. Now, it's important to understand who makes the call. Iranian lawmakers have, on occasion, even voted on measures related to closing it.
Right.
But the final decision, the binding one, doesn't rest with their parliament. It rests with the Supreme National Security Council, which is ultimately under the supreme leader.
So it's a very high-level strategic decision, not something taken lightly.
Exactly. And they have the means to cause disruption based on intelligence, past actions. They have several methods.
Such as?
Well, a primary one is mine laying. They can do this very quickly, quite covertly, using fast attack boats, submarines, even disguising commercial vessels to do it.
And mines are hard to deal with.
Extremely. Clearing mines is not just dangerous. It's slow, painstaking work. It requires specialized naval ships, highly trained people. It could effectively halt or drastically slow down traffic for days, maybe even weeks.
Okay, so mines are one tool. What else?
They could go for direct attacks or seizures of vessels. We saw this happen back in the 1980s during the so-called tanker wars between Iran and Iraq. Both sides targeted commercial shipping.
Right, I remember hearing about that.
And more recently, just in 2023, Iran seized a tanker called the Advantage Suite. That was a clear signal of their capability and, frankly, their willingness to interfere with shipping.
Okay.
Oh.
Any other methods?
Yes. The IRGCM, that's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, they're known for what are called swarming tactics.
The swarming.
Yeah, using lots of small, very fast attack boats. Some are armed with anti-ship cruise missiles. The idea is to overwhelm a larger ship's defenses through sheer numbers and speed.
Have they practiced this?
They have. They demonstrated it quite publicly in an exercise called Prophet 9, where they actually attacked a mock-up of a U.S. aircraft carrier.
That sends a message?
It certainly does. And finally, there's the growing threat from missiles and drones. Shore-launched anti-ship missiles, both cruise and ballistic types, plus their expanding arsenal of kamikaze drones.
Like we've seen the Houthis use in the Red Sea.
Precisely. Those attacks have shown just how disruptive even relatively less sophisticated missile and drone attacks can be against commercial shipping and even naval vessels. Iran's capabilities are significantly more advanced.
That's quite a toolkit for disruption they possess. A formidable set of options.
It is.
But knowing they can do this, the big question remains, have they ever actually followed through? Despite all the threats over the years, have they ever fully closed the strait? What does the history actually show us?
That's the crucial point. Despite all the rhetoric, all the threats, and numerous skirmishes and incidents over decades, the Strait of Hormuz has never been fully closed.
Never. Not even during the tanker war.
Not even then, at the peak of the Iran-Iraq War's attacks on shipping. Historically, when tensions flare and traffic is threatened, the U.S. and its allies have deployed naval forces and have always managed to reestablish the flow of traffic.
Okay, so it's never been fully shut down. Why not? If they have the capability.
Well, this brings us to a concept many analysts point to. People like U.S. Senator Marco Rubio, energy experts like Vandana Haryu, they often describe a full closure as economic suicide for Iran.
Economic suicide, why?
Because Iran itself relies heavily on exporting its own oil through the Strait. Remember those figures? For the financial year ending March 2025, their oil exports were estimated at around $67 billion.
$67 billion.
Cutting off the Strait would mean cutting off their own main source of revenue. It would be a massive, self-inflicted economic wound. Catastrophic, potentially.
Okay, that makes sense. So if it's economic suicide, why keep making the threats? Is it just posturing? A bluff?
I wouldn't call it purely a bluff. It's more complex. The threats themselves are a key part of Iran's deterrence strategy. It's about showing they have leverage, demonstrating a willingness to escalate if pushed too far.
So the threat itself has power.
Exactly. While a full, sustained closure might be self-destructive, even just a partial disruption, laying a few mines, seizing a tanker, firing missiles near the shipping lanes, or even just the credible threat of doing so, that's often enough.
Enough to do what?
Enough to send global oil prices spiking, to create huge economic uncertainty and pressure worldwide. It's a way for Iran to exert influence, to show it can inflict pain on the global economy, maybe without triggering that full-blown economic suicide scenario.
It sounds like a very dangerous balancing act for them.
It is. A perilous tightrope walk, absolutely. Balancing that show of force against causing crippling harm to their own economy.
Okay, so let's talk about that impact. If Iran were to act, maybe not a full closure, but a partial disruption, or even just ramping up the threats after these U.S. strikes, what would that mean immediately for oil prices, for the global economy, for, us?
Well, we've already seen a glimpse of it, haven't we? Just the news of the U.S. strikes and the rising tensions caused Brent crude oil, that's a key global benchmark, to jump. It went from about $69 a barrel to $74 a barrel between June 12th and 13th.
Wow, just on the tension alone.
Just on the fear, the anticipation of potential disruption. Now, if there were an actual sustained conflict or a more significant disruption in the Strait, the potential for a really severe supply shock is very real.
How severe?
J.P. Morgan, for instance, estimated that a serious escalation could take over 2.1 million barrels of oil per day off the market.
2.1 million barrels a day. What does that do to prices?
In that kind of scenario, analysts see Brent crude prices pushing sharply over $100 a barrel, maybe significantly higher, depending on how long it lasts and how bad it gets.
Over $100 a barrel.
Yeah.
And that doesn't just stay in the markets, does it?
Absolutely not. That translates directly to your wallet, to everyone's wallet. It means higher inflation across the board globally, slower economic growth.
Oh.
Think about it, higher fuel costs for transportation, for shipping goods, higher production costs for almost everything, especially energy-intensive things like manufacturing, agriculture, food production. Those costs get passed on.
So higher prices at the pump, higher prices at the grocery store.
Yes. And it could also force central banks around the world to react, maybe by delaying planned interest rate cuts or even raising rates to fight inflation, which affects mortgages, loans, borrowing costs for everyone.
What about specific countries? You mentioned Asia relies heavily on the Strait.
Right. The impact on major importers would be particularly harsh. Take China. They rely hugely on the Strait, not just for the Iranian oil they buy, but for a large chunk of their total energy imports from the Gulf.
So a disruption hurts their manufacturing?
Directly, it hurts their manufacturing, their exports, and because China is such a massive part of the global supply chain, that could ripple outwards and cause even more global inflation.
You also mentioned Russia earlier. How do they fit in?
Well, it's an interesting side effect. Russia, as a major oil exporter, would likely benefit significantly from much higher global oil prices. That could potentially complicate the international response, giving Moscow more financial breathing room.
That adds another layer of complexity.
Mm.
But wouldn't Iran risk upsetting buyers like China if they cause such a massive disruption, even if Russia benefits?
Absolutely. That's a key part of the calculus, and it loops back to that economic suicide idea. Alienating huge customers like China, who are also important diplomatic partners for Iran, would severely undermine their own long-term economic and strategic goals.
So it's a massive risk for them either way.
It is. They might achieve a short-term objective, like showing strength or gaining a bargaining chip, but the sustained economic damage and the loss of crucial international relationships could be devastating. That's why most analysts still believe a full, prolonged closure is unlikely. The costs just seem too high for Iran itself.
It's about finding that threshold then.
Yeah.
How much disruption is enough to make a point without triggering total disaster for themselves?
Precisely.
Now, we have seen big oil price spikes before, right? After major events. How have those played out? Do prices stay high or do they tend to come back down?
That's a good point. Looking at history gives context. You're right. We've seen severe disruptions before. Think about the Second Gulf War, or more recently, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Both led to sharp, quite dramatic jumps in oil prices.
But did they last?
Often there were relatively short-lived spikes. Prices eventually moderated, and that was usually down to a couple of key factors.
For sure.
One is global spare production capacity. If one source is disrupted, can other countries pump more oil to fill the gap? Often the answer is yes, at least partially. The other factor is demand itself.
How does demand play in?
Well, when prices shoot up really high, really fast, it tends to naturally curb demand. People drive less, industries look for efficiencies, economies slow down. This reduction in consumption then helps to pull prices back down from those crisis peaks.
So the market has some self-correcting mechanisms to a degree.
To a degree, yes. But a major sustained closure of Hormuz would test those mechanisms like never before.
Which brings us back to alternatives. Is there any real way around this bottleneck? Are there other routes countries can use if the Strait gets disrupted?
There are some alternative pipelines, yes, but their capacity is really quite limited compared to the massive volumes going through the Strait itself.
What pipelines are we talking about?
Well, Saudi Arabia has its East-West pipeline. Its capacity is around 5 million barrels per day, though they did temporarily expand it to 7 million back in 2019.
Okay, 5 to 7 million barrels a day. What else?
The UAE, the United Arab Emirates, they have a pipeline that goes from their oil fields overland to the Fujairah export terminal, which is on the Gulf of Oman, bypassing the Strait. That one has about 1.8 million barrels per day capacity.
Right.
And interestingly, Iran itself has built a pipeline, the Gorjask pipeline, meant to bypass Hormuz. Its capacity is smaller, maybe 0.3 million barrels per day, and reports suggest it hasn't really been used much since 2021.
So if you add those up, Saudi, UAE.
Yeah, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the EIA, they estimate that maybe around 3.5 million barrels per day of bypass capacity could theoretically be available using these pipelines.
3.5 million,
Yep.
but the Strait handles 20 million a day.
Exactly. That bypass capacity is only about 15% of the Strait's current flow, so the vast majority, 85% or more, of the oil that normally goes through the Strait simply has no practical alternative route right now.
That's a huge gap.
It is. And another point is that these pipelines don't usually run at their absolute maximum capacity day to day. So while there's some spare capacity, it might not be as readily available or as robust in a sudden crisis as the numbers suggest.
Okay, so Pipelines aren't really the answer for the bulk of the oil. What about reserves? Do countries have stockpiles?
Yes, they do. Strategic petroleum reserves are important here. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, keeps track of this. They report that their member countries hold over 1.2 billion barrels in public emergency stocks.
1.2 billion.
Plus, there's another maybe 580 million barrels held by the industry itself. So the market is actually considered relatively well supplied right now in terms of stored crude oil.
So that provides a buffer.
It provides a buffer, yes, against short-term disruptions. It can help smooth out initial price shocks and buy time, but it's not a permanent solution if a major artery like the Strait of Hormuz were to be blocked for an extended period.
It really is fascinating then. Even though a full closure seems unlikely, maybe even counterproductive for Iran, the global community still has to prepare for the possibility, or at least for significant disruption. It just shows how interconnected and, frankly, how fragile these global energy systems are.
That's exactly right. So to kind of summarize, a full, sustained closure of the Strait of Hormuz, highly improbable. As we discussed, it really looks like economic suicide for Iran itself, given how much they need those oil revenues.
And the international backlash would be immense.
Immense. From global powers, even from partners like China, who absolutely depend on that oil flow continuing.
Right. However, as we've really unpacked here, just the threat of disruption, let alone any actual partial interference, seizing a ship, laying some mines, a missile scare that's more than enough.
More than enough to send major shockwaves through global energy markets.
And that directly impacts you, listening right now. It means potentially higher oil prices, higher inflation impacting the cost of living, and just broader economic uncertainty. It really underscores this incredibly fragile balance in the Middle East and the huge power wielded by this one narrow waterway.
It does. And perhaps it leaves us with a final thought, something for you to consider. Given Iran's internal economic pressures, their undeniable need to project strength and respond to perceived aggression, but also their need to avoid that self-inflicted economic catastrophe.
Right.
What might the next form of retaliation actually look like? What action could they take that threads that needle, achieving a powerful show of force, satisfying domestic demands for response, but carefully stopping short of triggering devastating economic consequences for themselves? That's the strategic puzzle Iran faces, and the answer has huge global implications for all of us.